भाइयों और बहनों, राष्ट्रपति जी ने आपातकाल की घोषणा की है। इससे
गांधी जी ने एक बार कहा कि जवाहरलाल में और मुझ में ये भेद है कि जवाहरलाल चाहता है कि अंग्रेजों को यहाँ से निकाल दिया जाए, लेकिन अंग्रेजियत को यहाँ रखना चाहता है, और मैं अंग्रेजियत निकालना चाहता हूँ। अंग्रेज रहे हमारे मित्र बन करके, तो हमें कोई इनकार नहीं।
Well, I don't see anything positive really. The only positive thing possibly is after the emergency, it was very difficult to promote any kind of authoritarian regime. You know, it was a kind of antidote.
Please don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe.
Namaste, I am Mithilesh. Welcome you all to a new episode of the Eastern Report. Today we have with us noted historian Sri Christophe Jaffrelot on our show. Welcome, Jaffrelot.
Thank you. Thank you for the invitation.
Today we will discuss Jaffrelot's book, India's First Dictatorship, The Emergency 1975-1977. In June 1975, Prime Minister Indira Gandhi imposed a state emergency resulting in a 21-month suspension of democracy across India.
भाइयों और बहनों, राष्ट्रपति जी ने आपातकाल की घोषणा की है। इससे
Christophe Jaffrelot and Pratinav Anil explore this back phase in India's history, a constitutional dictatorship of unequal impact, with South India largely spared thanks to Indian federalism. Christophe Jaffrelot is research director at CERI Sciences Po and professor of Indian politics and sociology at King's India Institute. His most recent book is Majoritarian State. Here is the book. This is the best book and most wide-ranging account of the subject. I request my viewers to read this book and immerse themselves into the thrilling account of emergency. So, Jaffrelot, what motivated you to write about India's first dictatorship?
Well, there is a long history behind this book because, in fact, I started to work on it, on the emergency, in the late 90s when my publisher, who was and who still is, Michael Dwyer with Earth, invited me to write a book on the emergency because there was no book on the emergency at that time. So we had this project and I started working on it, but the life is always taking you in other directions. So I, in fact, embarked on another project, a biography of Ambedkar, and then a book on the OBCs. To cut a long story short, I returned to this project only after discovering a gold mine, that is the hearings of the Shah Commission. The Shah Commission, we will return to it, was the commission appointed after the emergency for investigating on the emergency. And Granville Austin, a senior-most scholar in the US, had collected all these hearings. He had been given a copy of all these hearings and had handed over his private papers to Johns Hopkins University, where I taught with Sunil Kilnani in the years 2010, 2011. Then I returned to this project, and with Pratinav, who had been my student at Sciences Po, we used these sources and others for finalizing this book in fact, a very short span of time. It took us only 2 years to complete what is, in fact, a very detailed account of the emergency.
So what challenges did you face during writing this book?
Well, one of the challenges when you do history, kind of history
Mhm.
of that sort, is how far can you rely on what people remember?
Right.
And, for such a controversial phase of Indian history,
Right.
you really cannot rely on people's memories. So after interviewing few people, we decided to work more on the basis of archives. Interviews were fine, and I had interviewed old timers among the opposition parties mostly. LK Advani, Madhuli Mai, socialists as well as Dan Sanghis and so on. But most of the book is based on archives, and that was a challenge also
Right.
of another kind,
Right.
but much more reliable.
Right. And so finding the people who were present in 1975 alive when you started the book might be challenging, right?
That's why, in fact, most of these interviews took place when I had initiated the project in the 90s. Because at that time, all these old timers, Madhu Dandavate, Surendra Mohan, Atal Jarit Vajpayee were still alive. Rajmata Scindia. So all these people, I interviewed them when I started the project in the 90s.
Okay. So in modern days, we have seen various kind of dictatorship, like communist dictatorship, military dictatorship. But why this dictatorship in India is called constitutional dictatorship?
Well, it is called like that because Mrs. Gandhi did not transgress the Constitution of India. There was nothing illegal in this emergency.
Right.
It was declared according to a specific article 352 of the Constitution.
Right.
The Parliament voted, passed this decision, validated this decision. The Parliament, by the way, continued to work. There were sessions in the Lok Sabha, in the Rajya Sabha. The parliamentary work continued. The judiciary itself was not directly affected. The Supreme Court continued to do its job. So you have a very specific brand of you can say dictatorship or authoritarian regime, and Mrs. Gandhi could even say an extra constitutional challenge was constitutionally met because she considered that the opposition demonstrating in the street were anti-constitutional when what she did was in tune with the constitution, and she was well, partly true, partly right.
So we're starting from the beginning. So when Indira Gandhi introduced or enacted this emergency, so her statement was, "Some people talk of revolution, as per your book. Our government has already begun one." So this was the initial remark by Indira Gandhi. So was this a revolution?
No, it was not a revolution. But you see what she wanted to mean, what she wanted to say. She wanted to say this emergency regime is intended to deliver for the poor. So she was, in fact, pursuing the same vein as in 1971 when she adopted the Garibi Hatao motto.
Right.
And she tried to justify the regime that she had established by saying, you see, we have followed the Western system, legal system, that protects rights. But by protecting rights, we have protected property. And she emphasized this in many of her speeches. And implicitly or sometimes explicitly, she meant that Now the poor will have their share. They will get their due, which is, of course, partly true. The 20 points that she presented as her program had few items in favor of the poor in terms of land redistribution, in terms of house sites redistribution and so on. But it's primarily a conservative regime, a regime which benefited the owners of factories, businessmen at large, because there were draconian measures taken for preventing strikes, the number of strikes, and there were many strikes in the early 70s, including in the railways and so on. But the number of strikes diminished drastically because it was very difficult to be on strike. And in the first place, trade unionists were behind bars. So all the leaders had been leaders of the workers had been in prison. So no, it's not a revolution. If it is a revolution, it is a conservative revolution, if you want, for making socioeconomic status quo even more obvious, with some caveats. And I really want to emphasize one caveat. There was some land redistribution, because it was much easier for Mrs. Gandhi to twist the arm of landlords when she didn't have to contest elections. One of the big problems in India in the 70s is vote bank politics. You need the vote of the peasants. To get the vote of the peasants, you need the landlords. And when you send landlords to the parliament, why should landlords pass land reform laws? There was no parliament. I mean, the parliament had been emasculated, so she could twist the arms of the landlords, but to a certain extent only. And it's not a revolution.
Talking about the land reform, right? So even the land reform is not implemented till today in India. Like most of states, some states implemented, and some states haven't implemented. Like there is upper capping, but that is there. But like giving the all your land at single place, it's not implemented, and there is hard in north. It's like a very tough resistance. Even the current government or any party try to do, it's very difficult. So what she did and she tried to do was quite remarkable, but it was not a revolution that you say. So there were large-scale subversion of institution of democracy. So please tell us that what all institutions were subverted due to this emergency.
Well, first of all, many institutions had become redundant. For instance, there was no election worth that name.
Right.
First of all, Lok Sabha elections were postponed 2 times.
Right.
And as a result, you did not need any election commission. That was the basic institution, very important institution of Indian democracy, that had become redundant. Secondly, the judiciary somewhat shot in its foot. And it's a very important point to keep in mind, because it's a lesson for today as well.
Right.
The judiciary had not been under attack. There was no frontal attack on the judiciary. The same people were there before June 75 and after June 75.
Right.
But the judges, the justices, somewhat preferred to bow to the government instead of resisting the government. Incidentally, very few lawyers resigned. The only one who did was Fali Nariman. All the others preferred to go along with the regime.
Right.
And they went very far, because they validated all the reforms, all the amendments to the constitution. And the worst was even elsewhere in the way they considered that habeas corpus was not necessary anymore. And when the government argued that there is no personal rights in the context of the emergency, Shanti Bhushan and Soli Sorabji objected and went to court, but the court, by 4 against 1, you remember that only Justice Khanna saved the honor of the court, but 4 against 1 said yes, there is no habeas corpus left. Nobody had forced them to say that.
Right.
It's the judiciary itself that preferred to fall in line.
Right.
So it's a very complicated situation. You can say institutions were under pressure. You can also say many institutions did not try to resist and prefer to fall in line. And in this book, we emphasize this dimension. Why so few people resisted? Why this commitment to democracy appeared so shallow? Why liberty was not something valorized, valued to such an extent that you protect them, and the judiciary is supposed to protect them. And we have a chapter on precisely some explanation in terms of political culture, but we may return to that.
So, Sanjay Gandhi's role in emergency, right?
संजय गांधी देश का नेता, नौजवानों का नेता। और जो कार्यक्रम लिए हैं युवा कांग्रेस ने, उसमें एक कार्यक्रम है जो हिंदुस्तान के लिए बहुत ही जरूरी है। वो कार्यक्रम है परिवार नियोजन का।
It's widely debated even today. So please tell about his personality and how he was the man behind this all emergency thing.
Well, he was not behind the whole emergency, but it is true that gradually he asserted himself, and Mrs. Gandhi relied on him more and more. She felt more and more isolated. And by 76, yes, he was much more influential. And he was a very specific character. There is one good biography of Sanjay Gandhi by Vinod Mehta. You know, one of these very rare biographies in India, because most of biographies are hagiographies in India. You have very few critical biographies. This one is a critical biography, but a very balanced one. And it shows that in the first place, Sanjay Gandhi was a very lonely child. His mother not taking care of him, so he was in boarding schools. Then he went to UK. He worked with Rolls-Royce because he loved cars. When he came back, Mrs. Gandhi started Maruti for that very reason, that cars were his passion. And when in 75, she was under pressure because of the Allahabad High Court judgment, because of the demonstrations of the opposition in the street. He stood by her, and she was always worried about who could really support her. You know, that's a stigma of the very complicated start she had, because when she became Prime Minister of India, she was not really supported by the congressmen. I mean, the leaders of the Congress party. They wanted to use her. They did not want to obey her. So she had this feeling of insecurity. She was a very insecure Prime Minister till at least the early 70s. And that continued, in fact. So she really established a kind of duo with Sanjay who could benefit from this. and he was very, you can say, ruthless, and decided to form a kind of parallel government with people who were equally ruthless, um, people who had hardly any political education. Bansilal, for instance, the Haryana chief minister who was to become defense minister. Gradually, he pushed these people, this clique, and he focused on two things with their support. One was beautification of Delhi. He wanted to transform Delhi into the ideal city, and that's how anti-encroachment drives took place, and in particular in Kashmiri Gate in Delhi. And the other thing he was very much obsessed with was the demographic transformation of India. So he wanted to control population. Family planning became his other obsession. By the way, it was there before. Family planning was already one of the main priorities of Indira Gandhi before 75. But he made it, he developed that at another level. So you add sterilization programs. During the emergency, 11 million people were sterilized. And that was largely because of him. So he was this kind of dictator. He was this kind of person to whom Indira could never say no. And that was the tragedy, because he realized, but very late in the day, that he was taking the country to some disaster. I think she realized that she would be also at the receiving end because of him. And I think it's one of the reasons why she lifted the emergency and organized elections, in order to let people say no to Sanjay, because she could not say no to Sanjay herself.
Adding to that, so if suppose hypothetical situation, if there is some other leader in place of Indira Gandhi and the similar scenario prevails, so is emergency could be possible? Is it due to Indira Gandhi personality?
Well, you can say it is partly due to her personality, for the reasons I have mentioned before. This sense of insecurity. You need to remember the context. She had been punished by the judiciary in the Allahabad High Court case, and she was supposed to resign from at least her job, her role as prime minister, till she could she could get the appeal. She was on appeal to the Supreme Court, and she was so uncertain about the decision of the Supreme Court on appeal that she preferred to declare the emergency. So you can certainly say that, yes, her personality, her sense of insecurity precipitated the emergency. But you can also say something else. You can say that she was already so much in command. The Congress party after 69 had let her concentrate so much power in her hands that structurally nobody could object anything to her decision to suspend democracy. So the party was already a kind of pyramid on its head. Everything was in her hands. So she appointed chief ministers, she changed chief ministers and ministers, of course. When she declared the emergency, she should have consulted the cabinet before. She consulted the cabinet after the night during which the declaration had been made. And in this council cabinet meeting, nobody said anything. Swaran Singh was the only one who raised his voice. He was to be dismissed soon after. And he was the only one. Why? Because power were already concentrated in her hands. So it's not only her personality, it's also the transformation of the party into a very, you can say, patrimonial instrument that made the emergency possible.
Yeah, so just like giving one reference, like coming from Shastri, like the personality Shastri was, and after Indira Gandhi, the complete transformation of a party, the grand old party of India. Like, so if suppose like Shastri was alive, this scenario won't have taken place. Like
exactly, because between Shastri and Indira Gandhi, you had the 1969 split.
Right.
And that split made a huge difference. The party used to be a party of notables with bosses, party bosses at the helm of regions, states.
Right.
And Nehru and Shastri had to negotiate with these people. That's how they could retain their power. And it was very much collegial in that sense.
Right.
After the split, Indira decided to go to the people directly, and she short-circuited all these party bosses because the party bosses had stayed with the Congress.
Right.
Instead, she appointed her own sycophants, and she could win elections not by relying on party cadres or bosses, but by relating to the people directly. This is the first phase of populism in India. We are now living the second phase of populism in India.
Right.
That was the first phase.
Why emergency was a North Indian phenomenon?
It's a very good question. It was a little bit more than that, but it is true that the epicenter was Delhi, Haryana, West UP. And I think it's largely due to the lack of capability of the state. It was not a very strong state in the sense that it was around Delhi where Sanjay had his supporters that it worked the best. In the south, first of all, there were alternative parties, DMK in Tamil Nadu. DMK was ruling Tamil Nadu.
Yeah.
So clearly, it was difficult for Congress to encroach on the state. And secondly, you have some resilient party bosses in some of the southern states. Devraj Urth in Karnataka, he was certainly a congressman, but with a lot of autonomy. So when you did not have a sycophant of the duo, Mrs. Gandhi and her son, you could see people resisting more effectively. And that's what we saw in the south. Same in Kerala, to a large extent. So it was indeed not something the South was so exposed to. And in fact, in 77, when there were elections for the first time since 71, the Congress party did well in the South. It lost elections because of the North, because in the North, the emergency had resulted in mass sterilization and many other atrocious policies, but they were not that strong in the South, these policies. So never forget that Congress lost in the North and lost power because of the North, but won in the South, and Mrs. Gandhi could be elected in a by-election in Karnataka for this very reason in 78.
So JP movement is widely seen as the major catalyst behind the sudden imposition of emergency. So what were all immediate causes behind this emergency?
Yes, that was one of the causes. The JP movement was in fact prepared by two states movements, one in Gujarat as early as 73, 74, and the other one in Bihar. And of course, Bihar was JP's state. So when the movement spread to Bihar, JP took the lead and became the leader. Well, this movement is a very complex movement. It's spontaneous to begin with, against corruption, against inequalities. It's a students' movement to a large extent. Students are particularly upset by corruption, rise of prices, but others join hands with them.
गांधी जी ने एक बार कहा कि जवाहरलाल में और मुझ में ये भेद है कि जवाहरलाल चाहता है कि अंग्रेजों को यहाँ से निकाल दिया जाए, लेकिन अंग्रेजियत को यहाँ रखना चाहता है, और मैं अंग्रेजियत निकालना चाहता हूँ। अंग्रेज रहे हमारे मित्र बन करके, तो हमें कोई इनकार नहीं। अब जवाहरलाल जी के सामने वो यूरोप का, अमेरिका का वो सारा नक्शा, 200 बरस से वो आगे जा रहे हैं। हम भी आगे थे। उस जमाने में यूरोप से कोई कम भारत नहीं था। दुनिया के किसी देश से जब अंग्रेज यहाँ आए थे, उस समय हम उनके किसी के पीछे नहीं थे, आगे ही थे, और बहुत कुछ उन लोगों ने सीखा, और बाद में इस तरह से हमें दबाया और बर्बाद किया कि हम क्या थे ये भी हम भूल गए।
And quickly it becomes a politicized movement, a movement that is supported by well-oiled machineries, including, of course, RSS, ABVP, will very quickly support these movements at the state level and then at the national level. Nanaji Deshmukh, whom I interviewed for this book, was the RSS person who will become the right-hand man of JP in BR especially and elsewhere. And then thirdly, other opposition parties will rally around JP, including Congress O, Charan Singh, the socialists, when JP being a socialist himself, of course. So he will get mass support, political support, and therefore will pose a threat to Mrs. Gandhi. And also because in June 75, Gujarat, the place where it started in the first place, is won by Moharji Desai, the Congress O leader. And she realizes that electorally these people are meaning business, and she may lose one state after the other if that continues. So she was really the back to the wall. And in this context, when the Allahabad High Court considered that she had resorted to corrupt practices in the 71 elections, in this context, she declared the emergency to save her skin politically. I think she thought she had to do it to survive politically.
Right. So, despite this major opposition, right, Indira Gandhi got support from parties like CPI, Shiv Sena, and like others. So, how come she was able to garner such political support?
Well, she received support from many different quarters, and this is typical of authoritarian regimes without any clear ideology. There is no ideology behind the emergency, and as a result, you have people coming from many different quarters. CPI is one, because for CPI, this is the great opportunity to indulge in forms of redistribution. I mean, at least land reform is something they believe in, and they are confident that it will happen. Yeah, CPI, Indrajit Gupta, for instance, and others are confident that it will deliver. But you have also Shiv Sena. Shiv Sena is supporting the emergency for completely different reasons, and primarily because of fear of being banned.
Right.
And thirdly, you have this other surprising Maharashtrian party, RPI, one of the largest factions of RPI, the party that Babasaheb Ambedkar had created, rallying around the emergency, also in the name of populist, you can say, pro-poor policies. But that's for the political parties. You have also all kinds of individuals rallying around the emergency for all kinds of reasons. Jagmohan, the bureaucrat who was in charge of urban planning in Delhi, will become the right-hand man of one of the right-hand men of Sanjay, because he thinks that the kind of authority he commands will make the cleaning of Delhi possible.
Yes.
And then you have also the businessmen.
Yes.
So many businessmen will be more than happy to celebrate the emergency. KK Birla, JRD Tata, so many businessmen will consider that an era of discipline has come, and that will be good for production. Era of discipline, of course, is the key word that Mrs. Gandhi will use repeatedly, and there is even a book that she prefaced with this title. Businessmen, many businessmen will rally around the emergency because they were afraid for their business, of course, but also because they thought that yes, at last, after so many years of strikes, of disorder, it will work. And that is something you will see beyond the elite of India. The middle class people consider that, yes, at last trends are on time. So the coalition, you can say political as well as social, behind the emergency is very large. It's absolutely unprecedented, in fact, in terms of the large, I mean the scope, from CPI to JRD Tata. When in India have we seen JRD Tata and CPI following the same leader?
Right.
You have to go back in history for
Yes, correct. Yes, so going back to that Allahabad High Court decision, right? So it was like very hard on a prime minister that your election is being discarded by a honorable court. So given that scenario, was there any alternative for Mrs. Gandhi to remain alive in politics and then again come back to power if possible? So please discuss about that.
Yeah, no, she could have decided to bow to what the court had said. She could have waited for the final decision by the Supreme Court, and if she had been obliged to resign, she could have contested again. That was one of the possibilities. But as I said, she was so insecure that she, first of all, did not trust the court as a neutral body. And secondly, she was also not so sure that her own party would not replace her at the moment she would have left the scene. And thirdly, she, even if the party was behind her, she did not know whether there would be free and fair elections because the opposition was very much after her. Morarji Desai himself, in June, said, "We know that we have to resort to other means for getting rid of Mrs. Gandhi because electoral competition will not do." Well, if he was prepared to resort to other means, then of course he had good reasons also for being afraid. And at the same time, Morarji Desai and others were mentioning the fact that the army could be invited to some mutiny. So for all these reasons, she preferred not to take the risk of owing to the decision of the judiciary.
So there are like rumors or some like where I read that even Manek Shaw was invited or he was interested to come for mutiny, but it never materialized, and there is no concrete proof of that. It's just a rumor. Yes. Yeah. So why is the coming to the resistant part, right? Even the resistant was not even. It was there prominent in Bihar and Gujarat, but throughout the India it was not even. So what were the reason for that?
Well, if you look at those who resisted the emergency and fought against Mrs. Gandhi, you have again a mosaic of people, very diverse. Of course, the group which is systematically referred to is RSS, because RSS um, had a large body of very disciplined
Right.
volunteers, and they could go underground very soon after the emergency was declared. Many of them, something like 2,500 people, were sent to jail, but many others went underground and were in a position to resist, to help the families of those who had been arrested, to relate to the diaspora for getting help, for getting funds. But interestingly, they were more interested in fighting for the organization than for democracy. And Baba Saheb Devras, the leader of RSS, who was in jail, sent two letters to Mrs. Gandhi asking for mercy, asking for a legalization of RSS in exchange of some support. He said, we can work together. You can rely on us, but please make us free again. So RSS fought the emergency, no doubt about that, but not necessarily for democracy.
Yes.
Another group that was much smaller, but probably more active than any others, was made of socialists,
Yes.
including, of course, George Fernandez, whose brothers were tortured, Lawrence especially, because the police was after George Fernandez more than anybody else.
Yes.
But nobody said anything, and they could orchestrate some sabotage, some operation, and he was arrested at the end of the emergency. So that's another group. And the third group, which is very often neglected, even sometimes ignored, are the Sikh of the Akali Dal. The Sikh people in Punjab were very active against the emergency as a group. Of course, you have individuals, all kinds of individuals. But these are the three groups, if you want: RSS, socialists, and Sikh Akalis mostly. In addition to that, you have so many individuals of all kinds who try to do something, who try their best. But most of the observers were surprised to see that there were not more. There was not a massive upsurge. Kuldeep Nayar, for instance, the journalist who has written one of the best accounts of the emergency, had not anticipated so much passivity, and not only among the laymen, but among the journalists, the media person, because the same way lawyers somewhat remain passive, many journalists indulge in self-censorship and did not do as much as they could have done. There were a few exceptions, of course, Indian Express because of Ramnath Goenka and Statesman. But as Kuldeep Nayar said, we could have said many more things, but we did not.
Yeah, so coming towards the JP movement, yes, so like in India, right? India of that time, especially, if something happens in India and beyond control, like our leaders of that time used to resort to blaming FBI, KGB, and even JP was labeled as a FBI agent. So was JP got some assistance from FBI or CIA or whatever?
It's very interesting because this is the era of the foreign aid. Mrs. Gandhi was attributing everything that was wrong, that was posing a threat to her, to the CIA indeed, the foreign aid, American imperialism. It's very interesting because, in fact, the only evidence we have of interferences by the CIA in the Indian domestic politics is in favor of Congress. Congress benefited twice, if we go by the book by Daniel Moynihan, who was ambassador of the US to India, of financial support by the CIA. Congress, not JP. We have no evidence. We have not found anything proving that the CIA was helping JP. But the psychosis was very much there, largely because of what had happened in Chile. The way Allende had been eliminated by the CIA. And that was something eating the headlines in 74, 75. Plus Mujibur Rahman assassinated also in the summer of 75. Mrs. Gandhi could say, look, democratically elected leftist leaders of the world are under threat. I'm one of them. They are after me. They want to kill me. So he kept repeating that. She said, they want to get rid of me. And the they was bracketing together American imperialists and Indian rightists. For them, they were part of the same world. They were those who are fighting against the people. And she was the one who was defending the people. But we have no evidence of the interference that CIA could have. Well, we have no evidence of support by the CIA. And the US, the West at large, did not criticize the emergency for months. The British people, the British government, kept mum and even supported Mrs. Gandhi. Jacques Chirac, the French Prime Minister, had an official visit in 76. The West was not unhappy with the emergency. You have to wait for the New York Times reports, the Guardian reports, for the public opinion of Western societies to somewhat shift and therefore put pressure on their governments. But frankly speaking, if they had been against her, they would have said something different.
So yeah, even so that's a trend in political system in India, right? People, if they are not able to deliver, they will blame someone. Previously, they blame Britisher. Then so they have some scapegoat. We say even Anna Hazare was termed a CIA agent.
And now they blame Nehru, but
yes, yeah. So that blame game goes on and on. So it's a vicious cycle that we have to suffer. Yes. So now coming towards the end of emergency. So why and how it got lifted?
Well, all of a sudden, in January 2077, Mrs. Gandhi announces that there'll be elections in March, and the emergency is lifted. Well, it's important to emphasize the fact that she did it. So it's not because of RSS, the socialists, or the Akalis that the emergency was lifted. It could have continued for many months, maybe many years, who knows. She decided to stop. And there are many interpretations. In the book, we list all the hypotheses, all the possibilities. I have mentioned one. she could not say no to Sanjay, and therefore she preferred the voters to say no to him. That's one possibility. Another one is she thought she would win. And the IB, Intelligence Bureau, apparently had announced that it could work. Congress could be voted to power again. And she thought that by announcing elections so quickly, the opposition will not be in a position to put its house in order, and yeah, that would work. Thirdly, foreign pressure, and I mentioned the fact that the media in the West were putting some pressure on the governments of the US, of UK, of France. This is something that she paid a lot of attention to. She could not stand the way she was depicted, she was described in the media in the West, with this constant contrast. Jawaharlal Nehru, the founder of the Indian democracy, the true democrat, has been betrayed by his daughter. You know, I do think that was one of the reasons why she also lifted the emergency. And last but not least, Pakistan was about to vote. And India could not vote, or was apparently unable to return to democratic procedures, electoral procedures, when Pakistan did it. So it was something, again, vis-a-vis the West, that she had to take care of. India has always been proud of being the largest democracy in the world. Even today, in spite of every evidence, this is a status, this is an image that they try to preserve.
Yeah.
So for all these reasons, she took the risk and she lost. But she lost, I repeat, in spite of the support of the South. And she lost also for an unexpected reason. That is, Jagmohan Ram left Congress and created Congress for Democracy and joined hands with the opposition. And that was something that precipitated the decline of Congress. If Ram had stayed with Congress, the story would have been different, probably. And a man who had no courage to do anything for 2 years, when he realized that maybe his turn had come, left Mrs. Gandhi and joined hands with Charan Singh, Raji Desai, and others. So, and she had to change very quickly the list of candidates after he left Congress, because she realized that all the candidates Sanjay had nominated would not be in a position to fight this formidable coalition that was taking shape. And incidentally, Sanjay was not for the lifting of the emergency. He was very much against.
Yeah, so coming towards the inspirational part, like inferences from the emergency. So what the positives and negatives one can draw from these 2 years, the turbulence period?
Well, I don't see anything positive, really. The only positive thing possibly is, after the emergency, it was very difficult to promote any kind of authoritarian regime. You know, it was a kind of antidote. She had created a reflex against authoritarianism till now, because after so many decades, things have changed. But that's the only positive aspect of the emergency. Otherwise, it was a real disaster. It was disaster, of course, politically, but it was also a disaster in social terms, and it had two long-term effects, and that's why we say that it's a turning point to some extent. One, criminalization of Congress started during the emergency, and Sanjay had attracted in the party people who had very dubious records and who stayed. And Sanjay will die in 81, but they will stay behind, all these tainted characters. And secondly, the emergency gave RSS a new legitimacy.
Mhm.
And not only they could get a better image, but they could also join hands with opposition parties, be part of the marginalized government. So really, you add a turning point in the long term. You know, structural differences. I mean, structural features of the Indian Republic had been transformed in these 18 months.
So now the drawing the modern parallels of emergency of 1975-77. So what we can compare with the current regime that we have, where like power is being centralized once again. So
Yeah,
what are the parallels? Can you
you
discuss
have you have some common features, and the one you've just noticed is the most obvious one. Concentration of power in a couple of hands, or clearly, because that has implications of a very similar kind. The chief ministers are appointed from Delhi. The party chiefs at the state level are appointed from Delhi. You empty out
that?
you a party from the inside. So that's clearly one dimension. It goes together with erosion of federalism because this is also centralization. Secondly, institutions are also under attack, and they were more under attack during the emergency for sure, but parliament not being a place for debate, that's something we see today to a certain extent as well. And of course, all the agencies, CBI and co, had lost all their autonomy, and today this autonomy is also declining. And third, the brand of populism that we saw under Indira Gandhi is reinvented today with one similar effect. Populism brings together people who have nothing in common. You see people from completely different social background together for a reason that is transcending the differences. So today it's in the name of nationalism, ethno-religious nationalism, that you have people of many different backgrounds joining hands. But what is the objective and what is the result? Socioeconomic status quo, growing inequalities, because the idea of bringing together such an heterogeneous coalition is to prevent change from happening, social change from happening. And that's exactly what Mrs. Gandhi wanted to do as well. No change, no socioeconomic change. So these are the similarities. The differences are massive. You can't say that today the situation is similar to what it was in 75, 76, primarily because you don't have 100,000 people behind bars. You have political prisoners. You can say that the Bhima Koregaon accused are political prisoners, but they are 16.
Right.
We are 16 till Father Stan Swami died. There is no comparison. And during the emergency, the kind of torture that was experienced by some of these political prisoners was also of a different kind. People died in jail. And secondly, the kind of censorship that VC Shukla implemented has nothing to do with the kind of self-censorship that you see today, which is based on a different modus operandi, IT raids, intimidation, sedition cases against journalists, or you make proprietors of media houses understand that if they want their other businesses to flourish, they better ease out the journalists who criticize the regime. But that's a different game. So the comparison is not necessarily heuristic. And last but not least, Mrs. Gandhi had no plan. She declared the emergency because it was a survival exercise. But she did not know what to do next day almost. I mean, I'm exaggerating, but the contrast with the very clear agenda of the present government, which wants to transform India into Rashtra. It's a very long-term agenda with an ideology behind, with an organization dedicated to this ideology. The contrast there is really striking.
If possible, can we discuss about your current work and future project that you are working?
Well, my last book is called Modi's India, the rise of Hindu nationalism and the rise of ethnic democracy. So it's a study of the kind of politics that has been introduced in 2014. In fact, even before, because there is a chapter on Modi's Gujarat, the launchpad of the policies which will emerge in 2014. So it's a study of first the rise of national populism. What kind of ideology is Modidva? What kind of technique of propaganda it represents? Then there is, of course, one full part on the ethnic democracy that India is becoming, not only because of some of laws, including the CEA, but also because of the role of vigilante groups. And I study very closely what it means for vigilantes to fight against love jihad or conversion. And the third part is on authoritarianism. How are institutions eroding and neutralized to some extent? So this is my last book, and the book is supposed to be out in India in 1 week. So you can you can lay your hand on it already.
So I'm quite excited about that. Like, we would like to discuss that book sooner than later. Yes. Yeah. Yes. So thank you for discussing in length the emergency and the impact and the takeaway from that for all of us, the young generation and the current generation of
You're
India.
most welcome. You're most welcome. Thank you for the invitation.
Yeah. Thanks for joining, Christophe. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Hopefully you liked this episode. Please don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe.